Dr. Sarah Chen froze mid-examination, her penlight trembling in her grip as she stared at Frank Sullivan's swollen neck wound. The tissue beneath the infected skin was moving, rhythmically, deliberately, like something alive was trying to claw its way out. It wasn't just an infection. Something was living inside the 70-year-old farmer's neck. Nurse Rodriguez stumbled backward, knocking over the metal instrument tray with a deafening crash that echoed through the emergency room. "Dear God," she whispered, her face draining of all color as the movement under Frank's skin became more pronounced, creating visible ripples across the angry red flesh. Eleanor Sullivan clutched her husband's weathered hand, her wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light as tears streamed down her cheeks. For 47 years, she'd never seen Frank this helpless, this vulnerable, the strongest man she knew reduced to unconscious moaning on a hospital gurney. "Prep OR3 immediately, Doctor." Chen barked, her professional composure barely masking the horror in her voice as she watched whatever was inside Frank's neck push against the thin barrier of skin. What had emerged from a simple hunting scratch, and how much time did they have before it killed him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days earlier, the morning sun painted Cedar Creek, Texas in shades of gold and amber that reminded Frank Sullivan why his grandfather had chosen this land in 1946. At 67, Frank still woke before dawn, his body conditioned by 4 decades of welding shifts and now shaped by the rhythms of his 50-acre farm. The weathered lines around his eyes spoke of a man who'd earned every wrinkle through honest work, stubborn pride, and the kind of quiet determination that built small-town America. Eleanor Ellie Sullivan moved through their 1960s ranch kitchen with the practiced grace of a woman who'd spent 35 years teaching third-graders and another decade learning to be a farmer's wife. At 64, she possessed the gentle strength that comes from surviving breast cancer and the fierce love that sustained a marriage through factory closures, medical bills, and the slow death of rural communities. Her silver hair caught the morning light as she packed sandwiches for Frank's planned hunting trip with their 8-year-old great-niece Emma. "You sure she's ready for this, Frank?" Ellie asked, wrapping the sandwiches in wax paper the way her mother had taught her. "She's just a little girl from the city." Frank adjusted his faded John Deere cap, the same one he'd worn when the Caterpillar plant had laid him off 3 years ago. "Eleanor, my daddy took me hunting when I was 7. Made a man out of me." His voice carried the gravelly weight of someone who'd breathed welding fumes for 20 years and believed that character was forged through hardship, not comfort. Emma Rose bounded into the kitchen, her blonde pigtails bouncing with excitement. She'd been staying with her great-aunt and uncle for the summer while her parents worked through their divorce in Dallas. The farm had become her sanctuary, and Frank her hero, a real-life cowboy who fixed everything with his hands and never seemed afraid of anything. "Grandpa Frank, can I really shoot a real deer?" Emma's eyes sparkled with the innocence that reminded Frank why he'd sold his father's vintage Harley-Davidson without telling Ellie. The $8,000 had covered 2 months of her chemotherapy copays, money their fixed income couldn't stretch to cover. "We'll see, little darlin'," Frank said, shouldering his rifle. "First rule of hunting, patience. Second rule, respect for what God put on this earth." Cedar Creek spread around them like a faded photograph, its population dwindling from 4,200 in Frank's youth to barely 2,300 now. The hardware store had closed, the diner survived on stubbornness alone, and young families left for cities where opportunities didn't require choosing between groceries and medications. Frank's Social Security check of $1,847 barely covered Ellie's prescriptions, but he'd rather starve than burden their nephew Michael with their problems. As they drove toward Pinewood Forest in Frank's rust-spotted pickup, Emma chattered about everything from butterflies to why clouds looked like animals. Frank listened with the patience of a man who'd learned that small moments mattered more than grand gestures, never suspecting that this perfect morning would begin the fight of his life. The morning air in Pinewood Forest carried the scent of cedar and damp earth, mixed with the promise of autumn that comes early to East Texas. Frank guided his pickup down the familiar dirt road. Emma pressed against the passenger window like a kid at Christmas, her new pink BB gun propped carefully between them. He'd bought it at Walmart 3 weeks ago, spending money they didn't have because every little girl deserved to feel special. And Emma had been through enough with her parents' messy divorce. "Now remember what I taught you," Frank said, parking beneath a sprawling oak tree. "We move quiet, we watch the wind, and we respect every living thing in these woods. Your great-grandfather used to say that hunting teaches you about life and death, about providing for your family." Emma nodded solemnly, her small hands gripping the BB gun with the seriousness of a child trying to impress the adult she admired most. Frank had become her anchor in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath her feet, and she wanted nothing more than to make him proud. They walked deeper into the forest, Frank's weathered boots making soft sounds on the carpet of fallen leaves. His joints ached more than they used to, the arthritis that came from years of physical labor, but he pushed through it. Sullivan men didn't complain about pain. His father had worked construction with a herniated disc for 15 years before anyone knew about it. "There," Frank whispered, pointing through a gap in the trees where a young doe grazed in a sun-dappled clearing about 50 yards away. "See her? Beautiful creature, nature's perfect design." Emma's eyes went wide with excitement, and something that might have been fear. The deer was more beautiful than she'd imagined, graceful and alert, ears twitching at sounds too faint for human ears. For a moment she wasn't sure she wanted to shoot it at all. Frank knelt beside her, guiding her small hands into the proper position. "Easy now. Breathe steady. If you're going to take a shot, make it clean and quick. We don't make animals suffer." But as Emma tried to sight through the scope, a tangle of thorny mesquite branches blocked her view. Frank could see her frustration building, the way her lower lip trembled when things didn't go as planned, a trait that reminded him painfully of her mother at that age. "Hold on, darlin'," Frank said, standing slowly. "Let Grandpa clear you a path." He pushed through the dense brush, thick branches catching at his flannel shirt and worn jeans. The mesquite was particularly aggressive this season, grown wild and tough from the strange weather they'd been having, unseasonably warm springs followed by brutal summers. As he forced his way through a particularly dense patch, a sharp branch whipped back and raked across the side of his neck. The pain was immediate and hot, like a branding iron pressed against his skin. Frank's hand flew to his neck, fingers coming away bloody. "Grandpa!" Emma's voice cracked with panic. "You're bleeding!" Frank looked at his crimson fingertips and forced a smile. The cut wasn't deep, just a thin line about 3 inches long, but it was bleeding more than he'd expected. "This is nothing, sweetheart. Your great-grandpa broke his arm in 3 places when he was your age. His daddy just splinted it himself and told him to get back to work." Emma's eyes filled with tears she was trying not to shed. "But what if it gets infected? What if—" "Hey now," Frank said, pulling his handkerchief from his back pocket and pressing it against the wound. "Sullivan's heal fast and strong. This little scratch will be gone in a week, you mark my words." But even as he said it, Frank felt something odd about the cut. It burned with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to its size, and there was a strange tingling sensation spreading outward from the wound. He shook his head, attributing it to his imagination and the adrenaline of the moment. The doe had long since disappeared, spooked by Emma's cry and their movement. Frank decided to cut the hunting trip short, partly because of the bleeding, and partly because Emma seemed shaken by seeing him hurt. On the drive home, Emma was unusually quiet, stealing worried glances at the blood-stained handkerchief pressed against Frank's neck. "Grandpa, do you promise you're okay?" "I promise, little darling. Takes more than a tree branch to slow down this old cowboy." Frank reached over and squeezed her small hand. "Besides, now you've got a story to tell. Your first hunting trip where Grandpa Frank battled the fierce mesquite and lived to tell about it." Emma giggled despite her worry, but she kept watching the handkerchief, now soaked through with more blood than seemed right for such a small cut. Something about the whole morning felt different, like the forest itself had been trying to warn them about something they couldn't see coming. As they pulled into their driveway, neither of them could imagine that this simple scratch would soon threaten everything they held dear. Eleanor spotted the blood-stained handkerchief the moment Frank and Emma walked through the kitchen door. Her teacher instincts, honed by decades of spotting scraped knees and playground injuries, kicked in immediately. "Frank Sullivan, what did you do to yourself?" She was already moving toward the medicine cabinet before he could protest, her voice carrying that tone that had made 35 years of third graders sit up straight and pay attention. "It's nothing, Ellie, just a little scratch from a mesquite branch." Frank tried to wave her off, but the handkerchief was completely soaked through now, dark red spreading across the white cotton in a way that made Emma's stomach turn. "Nothing, my foot," Eleanor said, returning with hydrogen peroxide, antibiotic ointment, and bandages. "Sit down and let me look at it properly." Frank reluctantly settled into his usual kitchen chair, the one with the slightly loose leg he'd been meaning to fix for 6 months. When Eleanor peeled away the handkerchief, they all gasped. The cut was deeper than it had appeared in the woods, a clean slice that ran from just below his ear toward his collarbone. Worst of all, it was still bleeding freely. "This needs stitches," Eleanor said, her voice tight with concern. "We need to get you to the emergency room." "The hell we do," Frank snapped, immediately regretting his language in front of Emma. "Sorry, sweetheart. But Eleanor, you know we can't afford an ER visit for every little cut. Just clean it up and slap a bandage on it." Emma watched from the doorway as her great-aunt carefully cleaned the wound. The hydrogen peroxide foamed and bubbled, making Frank wince despite his efforts to stay stoic. She could see the worry lines deepening around Eleanor's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she worked. "Frank, this is more than a little cut. Look how deep it is." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "What if it gets infected?" "What if, what if, what if," Frank interrupted, standing abruptly. "I've had worse injuries than this and never saw a doctor. My daddy worked with a broken back for 15 years and never complained once." "Your daddy also died at 62, Eleanor shot back, then immediately looked stricken. They rarely talked about Frank's father's early death, how William Sullivan had literally worked himself into the grave rather than admit he needed help. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the old wall clock and Emma's quiet sniffling. Frank looked at his wife's face, saw the fear she was trying to hide, and felt something twist in his chest. He reached out and touched her cheek gently. "I'm sorry, Ellie. I didn't mean to snap at you." He glanced at Emma, who was still hovering in the doorway looking scared. "Come here, little darling. Grandpa's okay." Emma rushed into his arms, careful to avoid his injured neck. "I'm sorry I made you go into those thorns," she whispered against his chest. "Hey now, that's not your fault," Frank said, stroking her hair. "Sometimes accidents just happen. That's life." Eleanor finished bandaging the wound, her movements precise and gentle despite her worry. "Promise me you'll let me keep an eye on this. If it shows any signs of infection—" "I promise," Frank said, though privately, he wondered how they'd afford medical care if something did go wrong. Their insurance had more holes than a screen door, and Eleanor's cancer treatment had already pushed them to the financial brink. He'd never told her about the second mortgage, about selling his father's Harley, about the nights he lay awake calculating how many months they could survive on his Social Security check. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Frank sat on the back porch watching the sun set over their fields. The corn was coming in well this year, but commodity prices were so low he'd be lucky to break even. The wound on his neck throbbed with each heartbeat, a persistent reminder of the morning's accident. Eleanor joined him on the porch swing they'd bought for their 25th anniversary, back when money wasn't quite so tight. She didn't say anything, just settled beside him and took his weathered hand in hers. "You're worried," Frank said. It wasn't a question. "Of course I'm worried. Frank, that cut. It's not healing, right? It's still seeping blood, and it feels hot to the touch." Eleanor's voice was quiet, but he could hear the fear underneath. "What if something happens to you? What would Emma and I do?" Frank squeezed her hand. "Nothing's going to happen to me, Eleanor. I'm too stubborn to die." But even as he said the words, Frank felt something was wrong. The wound burned like fire, and he'd been fighting waves of dizziness all afternoon. He'd blamed it on the heat, on getting older, on anything except the possibility that a simple scratch might be something more serious. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The cut throbbed and itched simultaneously, driving him to scratch at the bandage until Eleanor sleepily swatted his hand away. He lay in their bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to her peaceful breathing, trying not to think about hospital bills and bankruptcy, and what would happen to Emma if something happened to him. Around 3 in the morning, he got up and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. Even in the dim light, he could see that the bandage was soaked through again. When he peeled it back, the wound looked angry and inflamed, the edges slightly separated and weeping a clear fluid that didn't look quite right. Frank rebandaged it carefully and went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to consider that Eleanor might be right. Maybe this wasn't just a simple scratch after all. Maybe his father's stubborn pride, the trait he'd inherited and worn like armor for 67 years, might finally be the thing that killed him. By the 4th day, Frank could no longer hide the fever. Eleanor woke to find him shivering under 3 blankets despite the Texas heat, his forehead burning with a temperature that made her stomach clench with fear. The wound had transformed into something that looked like a battlefield, angry red skin radiating out from the original cut, hot to the touch, and weeping a yellowish discharge that stained his pillowcases. "Frank, we're going to the hospital. Right now." Eleanor's voice carried the authority she'd used to break up playground fights and handle parents who thought their children could do no wrong. "We can't afford it," Frank mumbled through chattering teeth. "You know we can't afford it, Ellie." Emma stood in the doorway of their bedroom, her small face pale with worry. She'd been having nightmares for 2 nights running, dreams about monsters living under Grandpa's skin, about dark things with wings that whispered her name. She clutched her favorite drawing tablet against her chest, filled with increasingly disturbing pictures of her grandfather, surrounded by shadowy creatures. "Eleanor," Frank said, his voice weak but stubborn, "I've survived worse than this. Remember when I fell off that roof in '98, cracked 3 ribs and still finished the job?" "That was different and you know it," Eleanor snapped. "This isn't about being tough anymore, Frank. This is about staying alive." But Frank's pride ran deeper than fear. He thought about his father, William Sullivan, who'd worked construction with a herniated disc until the day he collapsed on a job site and never got back up. William had always said that real men handled their own problems, that asking for help was the first step toward becoming a burden on your family. The truth Frank couldn't voice was darker than pride. It was terror. Terror of the hospital bills that would finish what Eleanor's cancer treatment had started. Terror of losing the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. Terror of becoming the reason his wife and great-niece lost everything they had left. That afternoon, while Eleanor ran errands in town, Frank sat alone in his recliner, fighting waves of nausea and dizziness. Emma approached him cautiously, her drawing tablet still pressed against her chest like armor. "Grandpa?" Her voice was small and scared. "Can I show you something?" Frank nodded, not trusting his voice. Emma opened her tablet to a drawing that made his blood run cold. It showed a man who looked like him, but with dark things crawling under his skin, pushing against the surface like they were trying to get out. Around the figure, she'd drawn what looked like tiny winged creatures with angry red eyes. "Emma, honey, where did these pictures come from?" "I see them in my dreams," she whispered. "The monsters are getting bigger, Grandpa." "They're getting stronger." Frank stared at the drawing, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with fever. Children saw things adults missed, his grandmother used to say. They were closer to the spirit world, more sensitive to things that couldn't be explained. "It's just your imagination, darling," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes when we're worried about someone we love, our minds play tricks on us." Emma shook her head solemnly. "No, Grandpa, they're real. And they're hungry." That evening, Eleanor returned from town with more bad news. She'd stopped by the pharmacy to pick up over-the-counter antibiotics, hoping they might help, and run into Dr. Martinez's nurse. "Frank, there's something I need to tell you," Eleanor said, settling heavily into her chair. "Maria Rodriguez says there have been 3 other cases like yours in the past month. Farmers, all of them. Cuts that won't heal, infections that don't respond to normal treatment." Frank felt ice forming in his stomach despite his fever. "What happened to them?" "2 of them are in intensive care in Dallas. The third," Eleanor's voice trailed off, "the third was Tom Henderson's brother-in-law. He died last week." The room fell silent, except for the labored sound of Frank's breathing. Emma had stopped coloring and was staring at them both with eyes too old for her 8-year-old face. "Did he go to the hospital?" Frank asked quietly. "Yes, but too late. By the time they got him there, the infection had spread to his bloodstream." Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "Frank, please. We can figure out the money later. Right now, I just need you alive." That night, Frank's condition worsened dramatically. Eleanor woke to find him talking to someone who wasn't there, his fever spiking to dangerous levels. He was having a conversation with his father, arguing about something that had happened 30 years ago. "Dad, I can't take care of them if I'm broken," Frank mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "You always said Sullivans handle their own problems, but what if the problem is bigger than me?" Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, gently stroking his sweat-soaked hair. "Frank, honey, you're burning up. We need to call for help." "No doctors," Frank said, suddenly lucid. "No hospitals. Promise me, Ellie. Don't let them bankrupt us." But Eleanor had already made her decision. While Frank slept fitfully, she crept into the kitchen and dialed their nephew Michael's number in Austin. It was 2 a.m, but family emergencies didn't respect business hours. "Michael, it's Aunt Eleanor. I need you to come home. It's your Uncle Frank." Michael, Mikey Sullivan, had been dreading this call for months. At 42, he'd built a successful career as a software engineer, but success felt hollow when the 2 people who'd raised him after his parents died were struggling. He'd been secretly sending Eleanor money for over a year, small amounts she thought he didn't know she was accepting. "How bad is it, Aunt Ellie?" "Bad?" Eleanor whispered, glancing toward the bedroom where Frank was moaning in his sleep. "I think he's dying, Mikey, and he's too proud to let me save him." Michael was in his car within minutes, driving through the pre-dawn darkness toward Cedar Creek. He'd seen Frank's pride destroy opportunities before, seen him turn down job offers because they required admitting he needed work, seen him refuse help from neighbors during Eleanor's cancer treatment. But this was different. This was life or death. As the sun rose over the Texas highway, Michael pushed his BMW harder, racing against time and his uncle's stubborn dignity. He knew Frank saw him as the son he'd never had, knew that disappointing Frank was one of his greatest fears, but he also knew that losing Frank would destroy what was left of their small family. Behind him in Cedar Creek, Eleanor sat beside Frank's bed, holding his burning hand and watching his chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty. Emma had crawled into the chair beside them, her drawing tablet forgotten as she watched the man who'd become her hero fight a battle she couldn't understand. "Don't leave us, Grandpa," Emma whispered. "The monsters can't win. You're stronger than them." But as Frank's breathing grew more labored and his skin took on a grayish pallor, Eleanor began to wonder if love and determination would be enough. The wound on his neck had opened wider during the night, weeping more of that strange yellowish fluid that didn't look like anything she'd seen during her years of treating childhood injuries. By the time Michael's headlights swept across their driveway, Frank was barely conscious. The infection had won the war against his pride, and Eleanor knew that their next few hours would determine whether Frank Sullivan lived to see another sunset over the farm he'd loved more than his own safety. The reckoning had come, and there was no more time for stubborn dignity or financial worry. It was time to fight for Frank's life, whether he wanted them to or not. Michael burst through the kitchen door at sunrise, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled business clothes, his usually perfect hair disheveled from the frantic 2-hour drive from Austin. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. Eleanor sitting beside Frank's recliner, her face streaked with tears, while Emma huddled nearby, clutching a blood-stained washcloth. "Jesus Christ, Uncle Frank," Michael breathed, staring at the man who'd taught him to drive, to fish, to be a man after his parents died in a car accident 23 years ago. Frank's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, his breathing shallow and labored. The wound on his neck had opened into something that looked like raw hamburger, weeping fluid that stained his shirt collar a sickly yellow-green. "How long has he been like this?" Michael demanded, kneeling beside Eleanor. "He collapsed around midnight," Eleanor whispered. "His temperature is over 104, and he keeps talking to people who aren't there." "Mikey, I think he's dying." Frank's eyes fluttered open at the sound of voices, trying to focus on his nephew's face. "Mikey, what are you? You shouldn't be here, boy. Got work to do." "Uncle Frank, we need to get you to a hospital. Right now." Michael's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making critical decisions, but it wavered with emotion he was trying to suppress. "No," Frank croaked, his voice barely audible. "No hospitals. Can't afford to lose the farm. Your Aunt Eleanor, she needs this place." The argument that followed was heart-wrenching in its desperation. Michael pleaded with logic, Eleanor with love, but Frank's fever-addled mind clung to the one thing that had defined him for 67 years, his responsibility to provide and protect even if it killed him. "You stubborn old fool," Eleanor finally exploded, her teacher's voice cracking with frustration and terror. "What good is the farm if you're dead? What good is your pride if Emma grows up without her grandfather?" Emma, who had been silent through the adult arguments, suddenly spoke up in her small, clear voice. "Grandpa, the monsters are winning. In my dreams, they're getting bigger and meaner. You have to let the doctors help you fight them." Something in Emma's words pierced through Frank's delirium. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to see clearly for the first time in days. "The monsters?" "The ones under your skin," Emma said solemnly, showing him her latest drawing. "They're eating you from the inside, but the doctors have medicine that can kill them, like superhero medicine." Frank stared at the drawing. a figure that looked unmistakably like him, but with dark shadows writhing beneath the skin. Around the figure, Emma had drawn what looked like doctors with glowing hands, fighting off the shadows with beams of light. "I'm scared, Grandpa," Emma whispered. "I don't want you to go away like Grandma Betty did." The mention of Eleanor's mother, who had died alone in a nursing home because she'd been too proud to burden her family, finally broke through Frank's resistance. He looked at Eleanor's tear-streaked face, at Michael's desperate expression, at Emma's frightened eyes, and realized that his pride was about to take away the most important thing in their lives, him. "Okay," he whispered, the word seeming to cost him enormous effort. "Okay. We'll go to the hospital." The ambulance ride to Cedar Creek General was a nightmare of sirens and medical equipment. Frank drifted in and out of consciousness while Eleanor held his hand and whispered prayers she hadn't said since her cancer diagnosis. Michael followed in his car with Emma, both of them silent with fear. At the hospital, Dr. Sarah Chen took one look at Frank's condition and immediately called for backup. The infectious disease specialist had seen unusual cases before, but nothing quite like this. The wound showed signs of tissue necrosis, and Frank's blood pressure was dangerously low, classic signs of septic shock. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Chen said gently, "your husband is very sick. The infection has entered his bloodstream, and we're going to need to act quickly." "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady. "It means we need to get him into surgery immediately to clean out the infected tissue and start aggressive antibiotic treatment. But I have to be honest with you. Given how long the infection has been spreading, there are no guarantees." Michael stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Doctor, what are we looking at financially? I need to know everything." Dr. Chen's expression grew uncomfortable. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm afraid the treatment your uncle needs, it's going to be expensive. We're talking about extended ICU care, multiple surgeries, specialized medications. Even with insurance, you're looking at potentially $50,000 to $70,000 in out-of-pocket expenses." The number hit the family like a physical blow. Eleanor gasped, sinking into a waiting room chair. Michael felt his stomach drop as he calculated his savings, his assets, everything he could liquidate. "I'll pay for it," Michael said immediately. "Whatever it costs." "No," Frank said weakly from the gurney, having heard every word despite his condition. "Won't let you ruin yourself for me." "Uncle Frank, you listen to me," Michael said, gripping the older man's hand. "You took care of me when I had nothing. You put food on the table, clothes on my back, love in my heart when I thought the world had ended. Now it's my turn." Eleanor looked up at her nephew with tears streaming down her face. "Mikey, we can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm telling." Michael's voice brooked no argument. "This man taught me that family takes care of family. Well, this is family taking care of family." Emma tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. "Grandma Eleanor, is Grandpa going to be okay now? Are the doctors going to kill the monsters?" Eleanor picked up her great-niece and held her close, not trusting her voice to answer. Through the window of the surgical suite, they could see the medical team preparing Frank for emergency surgery. His vital signs were dropping, and Dr. Chen's expression grew more grave with each passing moment. "Mrs. Sullivan," a nurse said softly, "the surgical team is ready. Would you like to say goodbye before we take him up?" The word goodbye hit Eleanor like a slap. She approached Frank's bedside, took his burning hand in hers and whispered, "Frank Sullivan, you fight. You fight like hell, do you hear me? We need you. Emma needs her grandfather, and I need my husband." Frank's eyes opened one more time, focusing on her face with tremendous effort. "Love you, Eleanor. 47 years. Best years of my life." As they wheeled him toward surgery, Emma called out, "Don't let the monsters win, Grandpa. You're stronger than them." The operating room doors closed with a finality that echoed through the waiting room. Eleanor, Michael, and Emma were left alone with their fears, their prayers, and the terrible knowledge that the next few hours would determine whether Frank Sullivan's pride had finally cost him everything that mattered. The surgery lasted 6 grueling hours. Eleanor sat in the same uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, while Michael paced the waiting room like a caged animal. Emma had fallen asleep, curled up across 2 chairs, her drawing tablet forgotten on the floor beside her, open to a picture of doctors battling shadowy creatures with weapons made of light. Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room at 3 in the afternoon, her scrubs stained and her face etched with exhaustion. The expression she wore made Eleanor's heart plummet into her stomach before the doctor even spoke. "We were able to clean out most of the infected tissue," Dr. Chen said carefully, choosing her words like someone walking through a minefield. "But the infection had spread further than we initially thought. Much further." Michael stopped pacing, his face going pale. "What does that mean?" "It means your uncle is fighting for his life. The infection reached his lymph nodes during surgery, and his body went into septic shock. We've got him stabilized for now, but—" Dr. Chen paused, her professional composure cracking slightly. "The next 72 hours will tell us everything. His body has been fighting this infection for over a week. At his age, with this level of systemic involvement, his chances—" Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. How bad? "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Your husband has maybe a 30% chance of surviving the next 3 days. And if he does survive, there may be permanent damage. The infection attacked his major organs. We're looking at potential kidney damage, lung scarring, possible neurological effects." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. She doubled over in her chair, a keening sound escaping her throat that woke Emma immediately. The little girl sat up, disoriented, looking around at the adults' stricken faces. "Is Grandpa okay?" Emma asked in a small voice. "Did the doctors win?" Michael knelt beside Eleanor's chair and took her shaking hands in his. "Aunt Ellie, he's going to fight this. He's the toughest man I know." But Eleanor wasn't hearing comfort. She was hearing the echo of Dr. Chen's words, 30% chance. She was seeing Frank's gray face on that gurney, remembering how he'd whispered that he loved her, like it was goodbye. She was imagining coming home to their empty house, eating dinner alone at their kitchen table, sleeping in their bed that would feel enormous without his presence. "This is my fault," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have made him go to the doctor sooner. I should have tied him up and dragged him to the hospital myself." "Aunt Eleanor, this isn't your fault," Michael said firmly. "You know Uncle Frank. He's more stubborn than a mule with a PhD in obstinacy. Nobody could have made him do anything he didn't want to do." Emma climbed down from her chairs and approached Eleanor hesitantly. "Grandma Eleanor, in my dreams, sometimes the monsters get really big before the good guys beat them. Maybe the monsters in Grandpa just got really big, but that doesn't mean they're going to win." Eleanor pulled Emma into her lap, holding the child close as if she could anchor herself to something innocent and hopeful in a world that suddenly seemed determined to take away everything she loved. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of medical updates that grew progressively worse. Frank's kidney function was declining. His blood pressure remained dangerously low despite multiple medications. Worst of all, he remained unconscious, lost in a fevered darkness that the doctors couldn't seem to pull him out of. Eleanor barely left his bedside. She held his hand, talked to him about their memories, their plans, their dreams. She told him about the trip to Ireland they'd been planning to take for their 50th anniversary. She reminded him about Emma's upcoming school play, how she'd been practicing her lines every day, how proud he'd be to watch her perform. Michael handled the practical matters that Eleanor couldn't face. He met with hospital administrators about payment plans, called Frank's insurance company to fight claim denials, arranged for neighbors to take care of the farm animals. The bills were already mounting toward 6 figures, but he'd liquidated his savings account without hesitation. Money meant nothing if Frank didn't survive to see it spent. On the second day, Emma stopped drawing altogether. She sat quietly beside Eleanor, sometimes humming songs that Frank had taught her, sometimes just staring at his still form with 8-year-old eyes that had seen too much pain for one summer. "Why won't he wake up?" Emma asked during one of their long vigils. Eleanor didn't have an answer that wouldn't terrify a child. Sometimes when people are very sick, their bodies need all their energy to get better, so they sleep while they heal. But what if he forgets how to wake up? The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswerably heavy. Eleanor found herself wondering the same thing. Each hour that passed without improvement felt like a step further away from the Frank she knew and loved. On the third day, Dr. Chen delivered the news Eleanor had been dreading. Frank's kidney function had deteriorated to the point where they were considering dialysis. His lung capacity was diminishing, suggesting the infection had caused permanent scarring. Most devastating of all, preliminary scans showed possible brain swelling from the prolonged fever and infection. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Chen said gently, "I think it's time to consider calling in other family members. Anyone who might want to say goodbye." The word goodbye shattered something inside Eleanor. She excused herself from the room and found a quiet corridor where she could fall apart without Emma seeing. 47 years of marriage, and it might end like this, in a sterile hospital room, with machines keeping her husband's body alive while his spirit drifted further and further away. Michael found her there 20 minutes later, sobbing against a wall with her fist pressed against her mouth to muffle the sound. "We're not giving up," he said fiercely, putting his arms around her. "He's going to fight this, Aunt Ellie. He has to." But even as he said the words, Michael felt his own certainty crumbling. The man who'd taught him that Sullivans never quit was losing the biggest fight of his life. It was Emma who first noticed the change. On the 4th day, while Eleanor dozed in the uncomfortable hospital chair and Michael stepped out to make phone calls about the farm, Emma sat beside Frank's bed coloring a new picture. This one showing him as a superhero with a cape, fighting off dark monsters with beams of golden light. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I made you a new picture. You're winning this time." That's when Frank's fingers moved. Just a tiny twitch, barely perceptible, but Emma saw it. She dropped her crayon and leaned closer. "Grandpa, can you hear me?" Frank's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, but unmistakably aware. Eleanor jerked awake at Emma's excited gasp, nearly falling out of her chair as she rushed to Frank's bedside. "Frank, honey, can you hear me?" His lips moved soundlessly for a moment before a hoarse whisper emerged. "Eleanor?" Dr. Chen arrived within minutes, summoned by the nurse's urgent call. She performed a series of tests, checking his pupil responses, his ability to squeeze her hands, his awareness of where he was and what had happened. With each positive response, her expression grew more amazed. "This is unexpected," Dr. Chen admitted, reviewing his latest blood work. "His white blood cell count has dropped significantly overnight. The infection markers are still elevated, but they're trending in the right direction for the first time since he arrived." Michael returned to find Eleanor crying, but this time with relief rather than despair. Frank was weak, barely able to stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time, but he was coherent. More importantly, he was fighting. Over the next 48 hours, Frank's improvement accelerated in ways that surprised even Dr. Chen. His kidney function began to stabilize. His lung capacity improved enough to remove the supplemental oxygen. Most remarkably, the wound on his neck, which had resisted every treatment they'd tried, finally began to show signs of healing. But it was during one of Dr. Chen's routine examinations that she discovered something that would change everything. While reviewing Frank's medical history more thoroughly, she noticed something odd in his blood work. Antibodies that shouldn't have been there. Patterns that didn't match anything in her medical textbooks. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Chen said carefully, "I need to ask you some questions about your cancer treatment, specifically about the chemotherapy drugs you received." Eleanor looked puzzled. "What does my cancer have to do with Frank's infection?" "Maybe everything. Tell me about your treatment regimen. What drugs did you receive, and how involved was your husband in your care?" Eleanor thought back to those difficult months 18 months ago. "Frank, he was amazing. He came to every appointment, helped me with the medications at home. He was so careful about everything, but—" She paused, remembering. "He never wore gloves when he helped me with the oral medications. I told him he should, but he said he wasn't afraid of a few pills." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. "He handled your chemotherapy drugs directly? For how long?" 6 months. Every day. He prepared my medications, helped me when I was too sick to manage them myself." "Why? What does this mean?" "It means," Dr. Chen said slowly, "that your husband may have inadvertently created his own immune system enhancement. Prolonged low-level exposure to certain chemotherapy drugs can, in rare cases, boost the body's ability to fight off infections. It's almost like he vaccinated himself against this particular type of bacterial invasion." The irony was staggering. Frank's devoted care for Eleanor during her darkest hour had literally saved his life. The very thing he'd never mentioned to anyone, the daily handling of her medications, the intimate care he'd provided without thought for his own safety, had given him the biological tools to survive an infection that had already killed other men. "So his love for me, it saved him?" Eleanor asked, tears streaming down her face. "In the most literal sense possible," Dr. Chen confirmed. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is medical miracle territory. Your husband's immune system learned to fight this infection because of his exposure to your treatment. Without those antibodies, he would have died days ago." Frank, who had been drifting in and out of consciousness, opened his eyes at the sound of voices. What's all the fuss about?" Eleanor took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Frank Sullivan, you stubborn, wonderful man. You saved your own life by taking care of me." Frank looked confused, so Dr. Chen explained the situation in simple terms. As understanding dawned on his face, Frank's eyes filled with tears. "You mean, all those months I was worried about getting sick from your treatments, they were actually protecting me?" "More than protecting you," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "They were preparing you to survive this. Frank, your love literally kept you alive. But the revelations weren't over." Dr. Chen had been in contact with infectious disease specialists across Texas, and Frank's case was generating significant attention. The bacterial infection he'd contracted was part of a larger outbreak affecting agricultural workers across 3 states. The pathogen was resistant to standard antibiotics, and the mortality rate was approaching 60%. "Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Chen said, "I need to ask you something important. Would you be willing to participate in a research study? Your blood, your antibodies, they could help us develop a treatment for other patients fighting this same infection." Frank didn't hesitate. "If it can help other people, take whatever you need." What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 2 weeks, researchers had isolated the specific antibodies in Frank's blood and begun developing a synthetic version. Pharmaceutical companies became involved, offering substantial compensation for the rights to study and replicate his unique immune response. The financial irony was almost too perfect to believe. The man who had nearly died rather than burden his family with medical bills was about to become the solution to his own financial problems. The research payments alone would cover all of Frank's medical expenses with enough left over to secure the farm and provide for Emma's education. Michael sat in Frank's hospital room, shaking his head in amazement as he read through the contracts. "Uncle Frank, they're offering you $250,000 for the right to study your blood, plus royalties on any treatments they develop." Frank looked at Eleanor, then at Emma, who was coloring another picture, this one showing their whole family holding hands in front of the farm. "What do you think, little darling? Should Grandpa become a famous medical miracle?" Emma looked up from her drawing with the serious expression she wore when considering important matters. "Will it help other grandpas not get sick?" "That's the idea, sweetheart." "Then yes," Emma said firmly. "Heroes help people. That's what heroes do." As Frank's strength returned over the following days, the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. His stubborn pride had nearly killed him, but his selfless love had saved him. The financial crisis that had kept him from seeking medical care had been resolved by the very illness that created it. Most importantly, he was alive to see Emma grow up, to travel to Ireland with Eleanor, to continue the legacy of Sullivan's strength, redefined now not as enduring suffering alone, but as accepting help when it was needed. The monsters in Emma's drawings grew smaller each day, until finally she drew a picture of Frank standing tall and healthy, surrounded by his family, with no shadows anywhere to be seen. At the bottom, in her careful child's handwriting, she wrote, "Grandpa Frank, the medical hero." It was, Frank decided, the finest title he'd ever earned. 6 months later, Frank Sullivan sat on the front porch of his farmhouse, watching the December sun paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and amber. The scar on his neck had faded to a thin silver line, barely visible unless you knew where to look. In his weathered hands, he held a letter from the Centers for Disease Control, informing him that the treatment developed from his antibodies had successfully saved 43 agricultural workers across 5 states. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee and a plate of the oatmeal cookies Emma had helped her bake that morning. At 64, she moved with the confidence of a woman who had fought cancer, nearly lost her husband, and emerged stronger on the other side. "The mail brought another thank you letter," she said, settling beside Frank on the porch swing they'd restored with money from the pharmaceutical research payments. "This one's from a farmer's wife in Oklahoma. Her husband is going home for Christmas because of you." Frank accepted the coffee with a smile that would have been impossible 6 months ago, not because he couldn't smile then, but because he wouldn't have believed he deserved such gratitude. "Hard to wrap my head around, Ellie. 43 families getting to spend Christmas together because I was too stubborn to go to the doctor." "Because you loved me enough to take care of me," Eleanor corrected gently. "Don't you dare turn this into another reason to beat yourself up, Frank Sullivan. What happened to you, what you survived, what you've given to others? That's not about stubbornness. That's about love creating miracles." Emma burst through the screen door, her arms full of art supplies and her face bright with excitement. At 9 years old, she had grown 3 inches and gained a confidence that came from watching her hero survive the impossible. "Grandpa Frank, Grandma Eleanor, look what I made at school." She unrolled a poster-sized drawing that depicted their family in vivid colors. Frank stood in the center, wearing what looked like a superhero costume, surrounded by Eleanor, Michael, Emma, and dozens of other figures representing all the people his antibodies had helped save. "Mrs. Henderson says it's going in the school art show," Emma announced proudly. "And guess what? I won first prize in the county essay contest." Frank examined the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "This is beautiful, darling, but you made me too tall, and I'm pretty sure I don't have muscles that big." Emma giggled. "It's not about how big your muscles are, Grandpa. It's about how big your heart is." The sound of tires on gravel announced Michael's arrival for their weekly Sunday dinner. He climbed out of his truck, not the BMW anymore, but a practical pickup that could handle farm work, and waved toward the porch. At 42, Michael had found a peace he'd never known in his corporate life. Working remotely from Cedar Creek, helping Frank modernize the farm's operations, being present for his family's daily life, it was everything success was supposed to feel like but never had. "How are my favorite patients doing today?" Michael called out, using the joke that had become their family's way of acknowledging how close they'd come to losing everything that mattered. "Patient is feeling grateful," Frank replied, standing to embrace his nephew. "Dr. Chen called this morning. The Sullivan Foundation officially launches next month." The Sullivan Foundation had been Eleanor's idea, using a portion of the pharmaceutical royalties to provide emergency medical assistance to rural families facing financial hardship. Frank would serve as the founding board member, sharing his story at fundraising events and agricultural conferences across the country. "I still can't believe you agreed to public speaking," Michael said with a grin. "The man who wouldn't tell his own wife he was dying is going to talk to strangers about feelings and health care?" Frank chuckled, surprising himself. 6 months ago, the idea would have horrified him. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Turns out when you almost die from being too proud to ask for help, you get pretty motivated to help other folks avoid the same mistake. As they gathered around the dining room table for Eleanor's pot roast, Frank looked at the faces surrounding him and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. Emma chattering about her school play, Eleanor discussing the foundation's first grant recipients, Michael explaining the new automated irrigation system he was installing. This was what he'd almost thrown away in the name of masculine pride. "Before we eat," Frank said, raising his hand for attention, "I want to say something." The table grew quiet, Emma's fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "6 months ago, I thought strength meant carrying every burden alone. I thought asking for help was weakness, and I thought protecting this family meant never admitting I was in trouble." Frank's voice grew husky with emotion. "I was wrong about everything. Real strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing who to lean on when you can't stand anymore." Eleanor reached over and took his hand, her wedding ring catching the light from the chandelier Michael had bought to replace the old fixture that had flickered for years. "The day I almost died," Frank continued, "Emma told me that heroes help people. She was right, but not the way I thought. Turns out the most heroic thing I ever did wasn't surviving that infection. It was finally letting you all save me." Emma set down her fork and climbed into Frank's lap, something she hadn't done since before his illness. "Grandpa, you're still my hero. But now you're a smart hero instead of a stubborn hero." Frank laughed, the sound filling the dining room with warmth. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said, kissing the top of Emma's head. As they shared their meal, the conversation turned to plans for the future. Eleanor's dream trip to Ireland, scheduled for their 48th anniversary. Emma's acceptance into the gifted program at school. Michael's engagement to Sarah, the veterinarian he'd met at the feed store. The new barn they'd build next spring, designed to accommodate the agricultural health research facility that would bear Frank's name. Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and Emma was tucked into bed with a new story about brave farmers and magical antibodies, Frank and Eleanor sat on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. "Any regrets?" Eleanor asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Frank considered the question seriously. "Just one," he said finally. "I regret waiting 67 years to learn that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And being human with people who love you anyway, is the greatest strength there is. Above them, the stars shone with ancient light, witnesses to a love story that had nearly ended in tragedy, but had instead become a testament to the healing power of asking for help, accepting grace, and understanding that sometimes the smallest scratch can open the door to the greatest transformation. In Cedar Creek, Texas, the Sullivan family had learned that heroes don't fight alone. They fight together, and that makes all the difference. Frank Sullivan's story isn't just about surviving a life-threatening infection. It's about rediscovering what it truly means to be strong at this stage of our lives. For too many of us between 55 and 68, we've carried the burden of believing that asking for help makes us weak, that admitting we can't handle everything alone somehow diminishes who we are. We've watched our parents' generation suffer in silence, and we've inherited that same dangerous pride. But Frank's journey reveals a profound truth. The love we give to others, whether caring for a spouse through illness, supporting our children, or nurturing our grandchildren, creates an invisible strength within us that we never knew existed. His devotion to Eleanor during her cancer treatment literally saved his own life, proving that vulnerability and love aren't weaknesses, they're superpowers. When we finally allow our families to care for us the way we've cared for them, we don't lose our dignity. We gain something far more precious, the chance to model healthy aging for the next generation. Frank learned at 67 that real heroes don't fight alone. They fight together, surrounded by love that makes impossible victories possible. What moment in your life taught you that accepting help was actually an act of strength? Have you ever discovered that caring for someone else unexpectedly blessed you in return? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today.